Hola, bienvenidos. Well, my name is Juan Carlos. I'm the manager of Camino Silvestre. This is where you, but forget it now. And well, on behalf of Alfredo, Jim, and the staff, we want to thank you for being with us once again. We're gonna keep doing this one every other week, so stay tuned and thank you for being with us, really. So, well, for our today's presentation, the truth about the water. We have Dylan Terrell, an Ashoka Fellow and the founder and executive director of Caminos de Agua. Caminos, a local non-for-profit organization working on regional water issues, has been invited to give a talk regarding the current status of water in San Miguel de Allende and the surrounding region. This is an important opportunity to learn more about the growing crisis that affect us all, even those living in urban San Miguel, and have your questions answered. This presentation will focus on the different aspects in our two main water problems: water scarcity. Scarcity. Thank you. That's my new word of today. Yes. And I'm lost. And water contamination, specifically arsenic and fluoride, which are increasingly affecting our entire region, including urban areas. The steps can take to ensure your water is safe and healthy, and the broader work of Caminos de Agua. I'm going to leave you with Dylan. Muchas gracias once again.
Hello, everybody. I'm Dylan. I had to put my timer on there so I don't go too long here today. So I'm Dylan. I'm the executive director of Caminos de Agua. Hey, good to see you. Good to see you all here today. We're here to talk about the water situation here in San Miguel. I also want to introduce Marco Orozco right here with the 10 on his shirt, and Dixie Ashley in the back there, who are both with the Caminos team as well. So any questions you might have later, you can also feel free to look for them, and they are more than qualified to help answer them. So let's just get into it, because it's a lot of information I'm going to try to squeeze in today. So hopefully we can get through it. But here's the agenda. This is what I want to talk about. Our water crisis. And to do that, we have to look at it more from a global lens and then kind of zoom in to here in San Miguel. And as Juan Carlos mentioned, we're going to be talking about two major issues that I'm going to keep coming back today, which is water scarcity and water contamination. And we're going to talk about specifically what that means for us here in the region. Then we're going to zoom into the region here, and more specifically San Miguel, and talk about what the consequences of all this actually is. Then I want to talk about solutions. Hopefully we have some time to talk about what people can do to assure clean water in their own homes here in San Miguel. I want to talk a little bit about who we are in Caminos de Agua and just some next steps of where we're going, and then we'll have some time for some questions after that. So just jumping in, what we have here is a map of water scarcity, of water stress. What we're looking at here is groundwater. These are aquifers. So how this works is that rain falls, and it falls on the ground, and some of that rain starts to infiltrate into the ground, and it collects in underground basins called aquifers. Now, this is an incredibly important water source for us around the world globally. This is where we drill wells into these aquifers and we extract it. It's the main user of agricultural water use in the world. And what we have here are all these red points here. Can you guys hear me okay from that right on the microphone? Okay. All of these red points throughout here mean that these are overstressed groundwater resources around the world. So what we once thought was that groundwater was a renewable resource, because again, the rain falls, it goes in, it fills up the underground basins, the aquifers, and then we extract it out, but then the rain falls again, right? Except that we're over-extracting at an extremely rapid rate, which means that we're extracting more water than can be recharged naturally by rainfall around every year. And so that's what all of these deep red points are around the world. And so what does that mean? That means that we start to get to this point of what we call day zero. And this is when a community's water supply actually completely dries up. And this is something that's actually happening. So in Cape Town, South Africa, you might have heard a few years back about people water rationing. Chennai, India, which is a population of 8 million people, went from one day to the next, almost during a big drought, of having to ration their water because they're in an extremely water-stressed region. And as you can see, we have a lot of that up in California and through right here where we're at in Mexico. And so we're talking about 35% of the global population rely exclusively, like only on groundwater. And about half of the global population are living in what's called water stress or water scarcity conditions at a high level. And a quarter of the population, over 2 billion people, are in what's called extreme water stress conditions. And so this is where you're getting dangerously close to this idea of hitting day zero and running out of water. And so if we zoom in a little bit into our state of Guanajuato, as you can see, we are this deep red. And if you actually know our watershed, you can see that we're the deepest red part right there. So how does this work? This is an index, and it goes from 1 to 5. It's not really important what that means, but 5 means you're basically at day zero. The state of Guanajuato is at 4.94. It's the second most overexploited groundwater in the country, right behind Baja California. And just to give you an idea, we measure this extreme water stress in centimeters per loss per year. We're going to see that we're talking about meters per loss per year in our groundwater, which means, again, that we are taking out more water every year than can be extracted than can go in naturally. And about 70% of all of the groundwater, of all the aquifers in the state of Guanajuato, are currently overexploited right now. So moving from this idea, this really scary idea, I know, of water scarcity, but there is hope. We'll get there. I want to start off by scaring you all. Into water contamination. So when we think about water contamination, we tend to think of this, right? Pathogens, bacteria, the nasty living guys in the water that are the little monsters that are going to make us sick and cause, children to die tomorrow. This is very, very important. It is the leading cause of water sickness and death around the world, especially for children. Are bacteria, or essentially what are pathogens is what we're going to say, biological contamination in the water, things that are living in the water, right? So this is very important, but we no longer have the luxury to only worry about these little monsters in the water. We now live in a world where we're dealing with all sorts of other things in the water. Emerging chemicals are the most serious water contamination problem we're now facing. We don't have the luxury just to worry about bacteria in the water anymore. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about these chemicals. These can be man-made chemicals, pesticides, right? Agricultural runoff, industrial runoff, and even groundwater contamination, which we'll talk about in a minute. This is actually a picture of Bangladesh with severe levels of arsenic. And so I want to differentiate these two guys here, because this little guy, we're going to find out he's actually pretty easy to deal with in the water. But these emerging chemicals are going to be much more complex and a much different story. And so specifically, one thing that we're very, very concerned about here in Mexico are two chemical contaminants called arsenic and fluoride. We're going to find that these exist naturally in the groundwater, especially in the middle to the northern part of the country. And we estimate about 21 million people are exposed in Mexico alone to excessive levels of arsenic and fluoride. And very, very conservatively, about 300 million people globally. This is a major, major public health crisis, and we'll talk about why it's going to be much more difficult than we think a little bit later on. So, what's going on in our region specifically? How do these two things of water stress, water contamination, come together, right? So first of all, we have to understand what is our region. What are the regional boundaries that we're talking about? And we in Caminos de Agua, for the entirety of our existence, have used a watershed as our natural boundary, as our zone of impact, because we're not a government entity. We don't care about municipalities. We care about how actually water is connected. And this is how water is connected, in a watershed, in a basin area. And so here we are in San Miguel, and this is the watershed region called the Upper Rio Laja watershed. And these 7 municipalities are all very connected by water. And you've got the raging Rio Laja that comes right through here in the middle and ends up in the Presa Allende here at the bottom. So this is a region, again, about 7 municipalities, about 680,000 people, give or take, about 2,800 different communities, both rural communities as well as urban places like San Miguel and Dolores Hidalgo and things like that. So this is what I'm going to be mostly talking about for the rest of the talk. I'll get into a little bit specifically about urban San Miguel, but really what happens in urban San Miguel and what happens up here impacts us in urban San Miguel and vice versa to a certain degree. So what happened? Well, we didn't have a whole lot of surface water, and that started going away. So we started drilling wells with the advent of tube well technology in the 1940s, mostly in the 1950s. And by the 1960s, we had a few hundred wells here in our region. And then what happened is that we continued to drill more wells. That by the 1970s, with the first green revolution, we were drilling wells many more wells here in the region. We had several thousand. And that into the 1990s is when we actually hit a couple thousand wells. But what happened between the 60s and the 90s is that we started to over-extract that groundwater, so much so that by 1983 or so, there was what was called the last Verdad decree on the state of Guanajuato, which meant that they prohibited the drilling of all wells in the entire state of Guanajuato almost 40 years ago, because they knew that long ago, 40 years ago, that they were taking out more water than was sustainable to extract at that time. How do they know? Because when they started drilling wells, they were drilling them tens of meters deep. By the 1980s or so, they were hundreds of meters deep, or at least 100, 150 meters deep. That by the 1990s, we were several hundred meters deep, at least 200 meters deep in a lot of these wells. And what happened is, what you can't see here, is that we started to extract more and more arsenic and fluoride, which is naturally occurring in the groundwater here deep within our aquifer, because we had to go deeper and deeper down. And so we started to take out these minerals that are very, very concentrated, existing naturally. What we have is just volcanic rock really deep in the aquifer that's been mingling for tens of thousands of years and putting all this different mineral and metal content into the water. And we just are unlucky enough that there's really high levels of arsenic and fluoride. So that's so much so that by 2019, we had well over 3,500 wells. So in the 1980s, we said no drilling of wells, and we had about 1,500 at that time. In 2019, we have 3,500 wells. So we can see that there's a huge systemic failure here, but we're not going to go too deeply into that right now. But what we're seeing is that the arsenic and fluoride levels are increasing. Because we're going deeper, we're extracting more water, we're concentrating those metals and minerals, and it's becoming a really, really big problem. So not only do we have really high levels of arsenic and fluoride, but we also have, obviously, this water stress and water scarcity, because we're having to drill the wells deeper and deeper, so much so that they're over 500 meters deep today in most of the new wells we test that have been drilled in the past several years. So what does that mean? It means that we're losing 2 to 3 meters per year. That probably doesn't mean a lot, but if you remember before, I said we were talking about, to get into the extreme high stress category, we're talking about in centimeters lost per year. We're talking about meters per loss per year. It's 1.1 billion cubic meters, which I know means nothing. So to put it in another term, that's about 440,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools that we are draining out of our aquifer every year. This is not a renewable resource. This is not a finite resource. We are over exploiting it. And to put that into another context, we're talking about filling the Presa Allende to its maximum point and then draining it, and then doing that 7 more times. That's the amount of water we're losing from our underground aquifer every single year. Where does it go? Almost exclusively to agriculture. And most of that, a large percentage of that anyway, is going to export. And so we're literally exporting our finite water resource in the form of high water intensive crops. Guanajuato is one of the largest exporters in the world of broccoli. Alfalfa is a huge thing here. We think that alfalfa might represent 25 to 26% of all of the groundwater use in the entire state of Guanajuato. This is where our water is going. So what about San Miguel? So in San Miguel, we don't get our water from the Presa Allende. We get our water from wells just like everyone else here. We are completely dependent on groundwater. There's about 20 urban wells in San Miguel. That's the water that gets pumped into your house, okay? And that water is contaminated. What we have here, we'll see this a little bit later on as well, but this is our water quality map you can see on our website. And you can kind of see urban San Miguel. So all of these red and orange points here means that this water is not fit for human consumption by any means. These black points up here mean that this is actually potentially acutely toxic because of the levels of arsenic and fluoride that we're registering with that. Looking here on the colonias, you can go in and look at this later on our map, but this is kind of what we're dealing with here. So this is the absolute limit that the World Health Organization says is okay for arsenic and fluoride. These are a bunch of different colonias in San Miguel that we're seeing upwards of 60% above the limit for fluoride. For arsenic, we're seeing some places that are close to 2.5 times above the World Health Organization limit for arsenic, okay? Now, one thing I just want to address, because it comes up a lot, is about all of the urban development in San Miguel, okay? This is a problem, for sure. This is from the municipal planning urban development document, and they're planning a 3-fold increase in the urban perimeter in the next 20 years. And so there's going to be a lot more people in San Miguel. Now, this is absolutely a problem. People ask us all the time, where's the water going to come from? It's like, well, it's going to come from the same place it always comes from, okay? But this is not the major issue. I'm not saying that overdevelopment in San Miguel is a good thing. By no means am I saying that. I'm just saying the water use there is really not the major driver. There's a whole bunch of other reasons to be upset about urban development, but water is not, for me, really the major driving issue here. Water contamination is actually going to be much more increased, which is definitely a problem. But again, we remember that this is where our water goes, okay? Upwards of 85% of all the groundwater extracted in our region goes to agriculture. Again, most of that export, at least, lots of it goes to to the U.S., to a few suppliers in the U.S., but also other places here in Mexico. And so about 85% is going to agriculture, generally speaking, in our region. In San Miguel, that's not true. In San Miguel, that number is actually about 93% of all of the water extracted in the municipality of San Miguel goes to mid to large-scale agriculture. So again, urban development, yes, it's a problem, but if we don't get this under control, then nobody's going to have any water, okay? One thing I just want to note, I mean, we estimate right now with the State Water Commission data available that we're about 30% overexploited. Okay, so if 93% of the water goes to agriculture, that means all of us here in San Miguel could completely stop using groundwater tomorrow, and we would not make a dent in we'd make a very small dent in the overexploitation. But it would still be going down. It would just be going down slightly less, but not even that much. So, what are the consequences? Well, there's one clear one right now, which is this idea of day zero. And this idea of day zero doesn't come all at once. We don't feel it here in urban San Miguel because, again, we have these 20 urban wells, and Sapasma's, they have a very hard job, I will say that, but they're doing the best that they can to make sure that all the colonias have enough water at any given time, and they have a whole system of how they do that. But in rural communities, that's not the case. There's usually one well that might serve several dozen, well, not several dozen, but up to a dozen rural communities and small ranchos, usually a little bit less, like 6 to 8 or so. And when those wells go dry, everybody feels it. So this is a place that we worked at that this water tower had been dry for 10 years because they were right next to a major agricultural production. And a community of 300 families, about 1,500 people or so, went from basically one day to the next of not having any water. They had a well for years, for decades, and then it just completely dried up and it collapsed in on itself. And this is happening much closer to home. This is a couple hours away for sure, but there's a community we worked in called Palo, Colorado, just about 15 minutes from downtown San Miguel, 20 minutes, where we were working there in 2018, 2019, and their well collapsed in on itself. Again, that was a community of about 300 families that was getting relatively regular water access, which for them meant about 3 times a week, which doesn't sound like much for us, but that's pretty good water access in the rural communities in our region. And the well just completely collapsed in on itself, and it was already hundreds of meters deep. So when that happens, it's a very expensive problem to fix, because you have to keep drilling deeper and deeper. And drilling hundreds of meters deep into the ground is a very violent and aggressive process that requires very big machinery, and it's very, very, very expensive to do. So what happens in a lot of these rural communities is that they're just left without water. And they have to do things like have trucks pump it, literally truck it in what's called pipas and fill up tinacos and things like that. And then, obviously, we have health consequences from the arsenic and fluoride. What are they? Well, fluoride, first of all, it's very important to note that we need fluoride. Fluoride is something that our body absolutely needs, but in a very specific concentration, okay? And what we see is that once we start to consume it, actually drink the fluoride at the concentrations that we're registering here, it starts to have the opposite effect. So fluoride is in toothpaste and all these things because topically on your teeth, it actually has it helps strengthen the calcium in the body. But once you start to consume it, at these concentrations, it has the opposite effect. It starts to deteriorate calcium deposits in your body. And what we first see, unfortunately, is that it makes itself very, very visible in the form of dental fluorosis. This is the complete browning and blackening of the teeth. They start to become weak and break off in pieces and things like that. This girl was only drinking water that was about twice the limit, which is a lot. But we see levels upwards of 12 to 15 times the allowable limit in some communities, which is going to lead to more and more of this. We're not seeing it yet, but we're absolutely going to if we don't get ahead of this. And this is what's called crippling skeletal fluorosis, which is actually the deformation and the weakening of bones. Now, as you can see, these two pictures are showing children, because children are so much more acutely impacted by fluoride specifically, as well as arsenic, but than adults are. So we can process it a lot better. You're not going to have major dental fluorosis when your body's already fully developed. But in the development stages for children, this is a very, very risky thing. And it's not just this, it's also cognitive development and learning disabilities in children. We have more and more studies over the last several years that have been coming out, longitudinal studies, that have looked at children who are exposed to relatively low levels of fluoride compared to what we see here their entire lives, and seeing a very close link between the learning and the cognitive development in children and IQ, essentially, and the levels of fluoride that they're consuming over time. Now, arsenic is a whole nother animal. Arsenic, we don't need any arsenic. Arsenic is completely toxic to us. Our body doesn't need it. We want to get as close to zero as possible, okay? And so much so that arsenic in groundwater was actually called the largest mass poisoning of a population in history by the World Health Organization around 2000, 2002, because of what we discovered, what was going on in Bangladesh. From the 1970s onward, there was a huge uptick of arsenic in wells in Bangladesh, and that's when we started to realize this is really, really nasty stuff, and this exists naturally. It's not something we really knew before. Again, we were only worried about those little monster pathogens in the water. We weren't worried about these other things until we started seeing things like that were happening in Bangladesh. And so I was going to say, you know, what does arsenic not impact? I mean, it pretty much hits everything, and the more we study it, the more we realize that even being exposed to low levels of arsenic over a long period of time can cause chronic conditions. It's very closely correlated to different skin problems, something called arsenicosis, which is like skin lesions. You can see this kind of builds up in the feet. Also cognitive development and learning disabilities in children, kidney disease, but very specifically cancers. It's very closely linked to two specific cancers, skin cancer and gallbladder cancer. But again, the more we're studying it, the more we're seeing that it's also impacting the kidneys, the lungs, the liver, and potentially related to those cancers as well. So this is pretty nasty stuff that we want to stay away from as much as possible. So before we get into how we deal with it, first I want to talk about how we can use this water. So one thing to note again is that we have pretty high levels of arsenic in urban San Miguel. Okay, and that's just a fact for everybody in this room. If you're in urban San Miguel, well, if you're anywhere in this region, you probably have pretty high levels of arsenic. So what we say is that, you know, nothing is complete, you know, contamination, all this stuff is ubiquitous, okay? And nothing is completely safe and nothing is completely, you know, dangerous. It's really a range, a level of risk. And so, you know, how risky is this stuff? And so just kind of looking at some of our uses of water, how can somebody tell me, just washing dishes and stuff, how risky do you think that is? Where green means we're not really worried about that, and red means, yeah, we're pretty worried. We definitely don't want to be washing dishes with arsenic and fluoride. What do we think? Yellow? Okay, anybody else? Orange? Okay, it's green. It's super safe. No, and this is why I do this, because it's really important to know that you don't need to worry about that, trust me. Washing dishes and things, it's not going to be a major risk. But what about bathing? Actually getting all of this arsenic and fluoride on your skin, how risky is that? Orange? Sorry? Red? Okay. Green? Yellow? I think we hit all of them. Let's see. Green. Arsenic and fluoride in the water is not absorbed through the skin, or very, very minimally. And the levels the concentrations we're dealing with is not a concern at all. And I always talk about, you know, I live in a colony that has some of the highest levels of arsenic in San Miguel, and I regularly bathe my 7-year-old daughter in that water without question. It is not a risk. It's a very, very low risk, because again, nothing's completely safe. What about watering plants? What about gardening? Green? Okay. That's complicated, and it depends. It's my favorite thing to say. It's complicated and depends. It's probably pretty safe. But specifically, arsenic has been shown to bioaccumulate in different sorts of crops, and different sorts of plants and things like that. There's not as much research on fluoride. It's probably not as big of a risk factor. But arsenic specifically in very high concentrations could be a risk factor depending on what it is that you're actually growing. So if you're going to be eating those plants, there could be a little bit of risk, and that's why it's yellow. It's still not going to be a huge risk unless you're, you know, just only growing like spinach or some heavy leafy greens, because that's where it really bioaccumulates, and that's the only thing you're eating all the time. Okay, then I might recommend against that. But generally speaking, here in San Miguel, it's not a big risk. But in other places where we're having really high levels of arsenic and they're producing lots of crops with that, that could be an issue for some of those crops for sure. Okay, last one, drinking and cooking. Red, there, we got to it, red. That's the point of all this, right? Arsenic and fluoride is very, very damaging when you consume it. So that means cooking with it and drinking with it. Now, why cooking with it? Because these are completely dissolved minerals in the water and metal, and they do not boil off. And so when you actually cook with it, it actually becomes more concentrated, and so it actually accumulates in there. And so drinking and cooking is what we're worried about when we're talking about arsenic and fluoride, okay? So why don't we just filter it out? So these are some common things that we see in here in San Miguel. This is the whole house treatment system. You might have seen it with like the nice UV lamp on it and these blue things. Lots of people have, especially this one, the Niken filter here, and the Berkey is becoming more and more popular in San Miguel, but this is probably the one we see the most. Lots of restaurants and hotels have them. Lots of people have them on their houses. So why don't we just put a nice fancy filter on it? None of these can remove arsenic and fluoride, I promise you. Arsenic and fluoride, again, are completely dissolved in the water. If we can't boil them out, we can't filter them out, okay? There's very few options to deal with arsenic and fluoride in the water. And this is, again, getting back to that idea when we were talking before about that nasty little monster, the pathogen that we're always worried about. All of these deal with that. Those things are really easy to deal with. You can even put bottles of water in the sun, and that'll kill off most pathogens in the water. Arsenic and fluoride and these emerging chemicals, this is why it's such a major issue for the 21st century. This is the thing about lead in Flint, Michigan, and all these different things is that normal treatment options simply do not work for these new emerging chemicals, and arsenic and fluoride are absolutely not excluded from that. So, how in the world do we deal with arsenic and fluoride? I'm not going to leave you hanging too much, so let's get into it. We really have three major options here in San Miguel. One is buying bottled water from a reputable source. It's not my favorite option, but it's absolutely an option. And if, especially if you're a renter here, this is, a completely acceptable option. I want you to be safe, absolutely. Reverse osmosis is the only commercially available treatment system that really, really works. This is a proven technology. It's super filtration, and it absolutely works. And the other one for us is actually just looking for a whole different water source that doesn't have arsenic and fluoride in the first place because they're so difficult to remove. And that's why we talk about rainwater. Rainwater is inherently naturally free of arsenic and fluoride. And when you put a simple biological filter on it, you can get rid of those pathogen monsters pretty easily. So just jumping into them, I want to talk a little bit about bottled water. So there are some issues with bottled water. All these numbers don't really matter except for these red ones here. This is a study done by the UNAM San Luis Potosí by Dr. Deo Gracias, who's been studying bottled water for many years. And she actually found in Garrafón water, the most expensive water, she was registering levels of fluoride upwards of more than 3 times above the allowable limit, above the Mexican allowable limit, and arsenic upwards of 7 times above the World Health Organization recommendations in expensive bottled water. Some people might have heard, or probably not, but in 2019, Peñafiel, maybe the largest producer, I don't know for sure, of mineral water in Mexico, had to shut down their plant because they found excessive levels of arsenic. They weren't doing their treatment really well. So I'm not trying to scare people, but just to say that there are some issues, I would say, throughout the country where we can't always be 100% sure with bottled water. There's a really easy way to test bottled water that we can talk about later. To make sure that it was treated properly with reverse osmosis, but there is a potential risk. But I will say, in urban San Miguel, we can say it's questionable, the water quality, but we're pretty secure in San Miguel. Everything we've seen in San Miguel, the water seems to be good. Specifically, there's a local provider called Marnier. We've been to their plants. They're here in San Miguel, and they're always above board. They're doing their treatment well. The owner very much knows the arsenic and fluoride issues and is very much above board. The other bottled water is why I just wanted to mention that before, because we don't always know. Most of it gets trucked in from Celaya or from Querétaro, and we don't really know, any given day how good they're doing their treatment, but we've never seen an issue, so I don't want to over-scare it. So when we look about these available solutions, the main thing with bottled water is that it's easy, right? There's the effort, well, I guess carrying garrafones can be pretty heavy, but generally speaking, it's pretty easy and doesn't require a whole lot of effort. Reverse osmosis, though, but if you do have a home and you're just looking to, do it, essentially with installing your own reverse osmosis system just cuts out the middleman, because that's what bottled water companies should be doing, is doing reverse osmosis. And so if you install your own system, it fits underneath the sink, and it's pretty easy it's relatively easy to, well, it's very easy to use. It's a little bit of effort to obtain. You need a plumber to install it or someone who knows what they're doing. It's not, just tabletop filter or anything like that. It does require a decent amount of maintenance and stuff like that, but it's going to be way cheaper over the long term, substantially cheaper. 2 pesos per liter versus half a peso per liter or so. And the environmental impact is relatively low, and the water quality is excellent, and it's very easy to test for. Now rainwater, that's just what it looks like. It's not a very good picture, but if you're ever looking for it, it should have this giant tank under there because it needs that. But yeah, I mean, the thing is that people talk about how much reverse osmosis wastes a good amount of water, but it's not, in the grand scheme of things, a huge, huge issue. So, one thing I just want to mention, I just want to point out here, this is the Cieneguita Bridge. I don't know if people here remember that in 2018, the whole thing collapsed. I think it happened again last year, actually, because of our major, major rain year, right? And now they're building that whole new bridge because of this over flooding, right? But how can that be? The regional narrative is that we don't have any water, right? That's what I've just been saying this whole time, is that we're running out of water, we don't have any water. Then how do things like this happen, right? And this is because of our relationship with rain. We look at rain as what? A nuisance. I mean, I guess, if you're talking about agricultural production and things like that, you probably think it's pretty okay. But here in the urban center, everything we design everything as if it's a nuisance, right? Rain falls, it goes into gutters, into the sewers, and it goes away. Where does it go? I don't know. Just away from me, please. Get it out of here, right? And that's our relationship with rain. We have umbrellas. But if we try to change the chip a little bit, and our relationship, and we look at rain as literally, a resource, right? A resource that quite literally falls on our head. We can't say that about many resources, but this is actually a really clean water source that falls on our head, and we are talking about, there's no water. No, I think we just need to change our perception a little bit, okay? Now, I know what you're going to say, Dylan, but we live in a semi-arid environment. We have an 8-month dry season. There's not enough rain, right? Okay, let's talk about it. This is the average annual rainfall for Mexico, okay? About 760 millimeters per year. San Miguel is a little bit lower than that, 565 millimeters per year. Okay, absolutely. We don't have a ton of rain. But let's take a look at Tucson, Arizona. Tucson, Arizona has like almost half of what we have. Why the heck do we care about Tucson, Arizona? Because Tucson, Arizona is one of the global leaders of rainwater harvesting in the world. In fact, almost all of the really cool rainwater technology that comes out of really arid, semi-desertic environments, because it's a very limited resource, and they realize we should take advantage of this resource that falls very seldomly here. And so we can absolutely harvest enough rain here. In fact, the president of the Water Commission of the state of Mexico said that there's absolutely enough rainfall in this country to meet the demand, the supply demands of the entire population, period, for all of our uses. Not just drinking and cooking that I'm talking a lot about, but for all of our uses, we absolutely have enough rainfall. It's just about capturing it. And that's a pretty easy thing to do, it turns out. So that's why we talk a lot about rainwater harvesting. So it's the most inexpensive option in the long term, absolutely. The water quality is absolutely excellent. It's very easy to verify that. The maintenance is pretty low. It's the most sustainable option because not only is, you're literally capturing it on your own roof, the energy needed to run it can be zero if you want it. You don't actually need energy because water falls on the roof and you just literally you direct it. We're not talking about a really crazy science here. It's we have engineers that work with us, but they don't work a lot on rainwater because it's a pretty easy science to deal with. But you're also taking very little, but you're taking some stress off of overexploited aquifers, right? Because this is water that we're not taking out of the aquifer. And for this rain to actually get to the aquifer, it's going to take decades, if not longer. So rainwater harvesting systems can look like a bunch of different ways, but they're pretty simple ideas. Again, you need some sort of roof surface, or surface area, and we have roofs, and then we just put them into gutters or tubing, and it goes down. You have what we call the first flush system, which is the first system to kind of clean off the roof a little bit, goes into the tank and stored there. And then again, going back to those filtration options, like we do have to we are worried about those monster pathogens because that can grow, especially if you're storing rainwater for a long time. but they're really easy to deal with. Every filter will deal with them. This is, we make our own filter that deals with that kind of stuff. It's really a simple process. So, and just one thing I want to note here, this is from partners of ours, the biggest rainwater harvesting group in Mexico called Isla Urbana out of Mexico City. But they talk a lot about, they just retrofit existing cisterns. About 65% of the population already has an underground cistern. I bet you almost everybody in here has a cistern. You might not even know you have a cistern. You might think that you only have this thing on your roof. But I bet you have one of these too, and you just don't even know it. And this can store a lot of rainwater. It can be retrofitted. And why am I talking about this? Because this is the most expensive part, is storing that water. We have to store the water for a long period of time, so you want to store as much as possible. But most homes already have these on them. And so then what are you talking about? You're talking about some tubes, pretty much. I mean, this can be a really inexpensive option. You need someone to install it, obviously, but a couple filters on there, you can make it a fancy-looking thing. But at the end of the day, it's kind of hard to spend, $10,000 on a rainwater harvesting system. It really is. So I just kind of want to talk about, okay, who the heck are we? Caminos de Agua. So we are both a very technical organization as well as a social environmental organization. We've been working here in the region for about 10 years now, a little over 10 years. And we have, engineers who are working hand in hand with community organizers and educators in the field to essentially design and implement water solutions that for those who are most impacted by all these water problems I've been talking about, which is mostly the rural communities throughout the region. There's about 500 or so rural communities here in San Miguel, again, over 2,000 in our watershed region. And we're a team, we're a full-time staff right now of about 15 people. And we do a bunch of different things. So first of all, our mission is to improve human health and community well-being through adequate and affordable access to clean water. We have 5 major programs right now. So one, which I've been alluding to, is our water monitoring program, which is us actually going out and trying to figure out what's going on out there with our, specifically arsenic and fluoride, but also other potential issues. We're developing new solutions through our technology development program because, as I think I've made clear, arsenic and fluoride are really hard to deal with, and there's not a lot of solutions out there. So we're trying to figure out other ways to deal with that. And we do community implementation, mostly rainwater harvesting. We also do composting toilet programs and things like that. We have a lot of education programs, and we're doing a lot more of what we call advocacy, which is working towards true systemic change, which I'll talk about in just a second here. But just to get into it very briefly, but I just kind of want to go through some of it. Our water quality monitoring program, our water monitoring program, is the oldest program, the first one that I started years ago when it was just me kind of bumbling around the region here trying to figure out what to do with my time. And we've been doing it for over 10 years now. We've tested well over 600 sites throughout the region. We've done this very consciously with various university partners. Because it is a relatively political issue, we wanted to have really good water quality results that we can talk about. And we published all this on our online map. So you can go online and take a look at, you can zoom into your colonia, or if you're living somewhere out here, you can kind of see what's going on out there. These green points mean that this is okay, at least for now. It doesn't mean it's going to be always okay, because things change relatively rapidly here. But the orange points mean that children should not be drinking this water regularly, at least. The red points mean that none of us should really be drinking this for long periods of time. And these black points that you can see up here, there's a couple here in San Miguel as well, means that this is actually potentially acutely, whoa, did that just turn on? That's what it's supposed to sound like. Well, I've been talking to this, okay. Acutely toxic, and so this means that nobody should really ever drink this at all, ever. And so just to give you an idea of what it is that we actually see in this region, so I showed you a little bit of what's going on in urban San Miguel. The story's a little bit different when we kind of explode out to the region and see who's really, really impacted. So this line right here is the maximum amount of fluoride that the World Health Organization and the Mexican government say is safe for consumption, about 1.5 milligrams per liter. All these red ones are above that. You can see this is 3 to 4 times above that limit. And you see a couple of these black ones here where we're talking about 12 times and I think upwards of 15 times in this case here. And these are all community wells, and this is all water that people are actually having to drink. And arsenic is another animal here. So what we have here is the World Health Organization limit. This blue line right here, this is like the maximum. And about 40% of all the sites we've tested are above the World Health Organization limits for arsenic as well as for fluoride. This red line here is unfortunately, the Mexican norm, the Mexican legal limit. Mexico is one of the few countries in the world that refuses to get on board with the World Health Organization. Most other countries have gone towards the World Health Organization standard because, again, the more we study about the arsenic, the more we realize that it's really, really dangerous stuff, and that even at these levels down here, being exposed over time can cause chronic conditions and even cancers. So again, unfortunately, this is the legal limit in Mexico. Still about 15% of all the sites we test are above that, and some as high as this guy right here, which is showing that it's 23 times above the World Health Organization limit. And just to harp on a little bit more, most countries are actually saying that the World Health Organization is not being aggressive enough. Because again, arsenic is really hard to remove out of the water, so the World Health Organization has to kind of create some limits based on what's actually feasible for populations to do. And lots of other countries like the Netherlands have gone to 3. So like this is at 10, this is at 25, they're down here at 3. The U.S., there's a big movement in the U.S. to go to 3 as well. So most people are going away from that. Unfortunately, Mexico is still stagnant here at a really high level. But we're not really interested in legal matters in Caminos de Agua. We're much more interested in the impacts on human health, and so we make sure everything is below that limit. And again, these are real community wells. This is water that people are absolutely drinking this water because they have no other source. Because those solutions I talked about before, bottled water and reverse osmosis specifically, are not options for most of these rural communities. They're just not. Reverse osmosis is pretty technical, and it's just too expensive, and it wastes a lot of water. There's a bunch of issues. And bottled water just isn't accessible to a lot of these families, unfortunately. It's just expensive. And just to talk very briefly about some of the stuff that we do with our water monitoring program and why we do it. It's not just to see where the problems are, but it's also to kind of track trends over time. And so what we're seeing here is these light blue ones are wells that we tested between 2013 and 2015, and the dark blue is that same well a couple years later, 2 or 3 years later. And as we can see, some of these, this is a 4-fold increase in arsenic in just a 2 to 3 year period of time. We are not seeing this with fluoride. Fluoride's going up very, very slowly. Arsenic is starting to spike. And where is it spiking? Well, in several rural areas, but in urban San Miguel as well. And there's a whole reason behind what I'm not going to go into right now, but we're seeing spikes of arsenic in urban San Miguel specifically, which is why we're here to talk about this issue. And this is, I didn't mention it before, there was a logo on there, but this is part of our urban water initiative of why we're trying to do more and more events in the urban center, because there's major issues with specifically water quality and specifically arsenic in the urban center of San Miguel. One thing to note is that we've been working with a national network on this for years now called INCA, which is the National Water Quality Inventory. It's a group of organizations, but mostly academics, and we've published a book on arsenic and fluoride contamination with the federal government. So that was a big win to have the federal government actually admit that there's this massive problem happening throughout the country. And through this is how we got to that number of about 21 million Mexicans who are exposed to excessive levels of arsenic and fluoride in their water, because we got federal national water quality data from CONAGUA, the Federal Water Authority. So this is, I know it looks like a mess, but this is our water quality map. And so you can actually not just be in our area, but you can zoom out to other parts of the country and see that there's some pretty heavy issues of arsenic and fluoride throughout the rest of the country, mostly from this middle region up, but also in some other parts, specifically arsenic that can come in from non-natural places like through mining and things like that. And just to note, one thing that we do with our water quality program is that we offer water quality testing in the urban center and other places, private testing, which helps support that program specifically. So if you want to know what the water quality is in your own home, you can test it with us. Absolutely, we have a couple different tests that we do, and that'll help support that program specifically. We do lots of education programs, mostly community education. Obviously, we're working in rural communities quite frequently, doing different education programs. One of the big ones we're doing now is what we call the water learning community. We're actually working with dozens of community leaders and community organizers every 3 months. We have, with our partner organizations, with ANANA, which is a big partner of ours, and some of the grassroots organizations that we collaborate with, are trying to build the next generation of community leaders so that we work very closely with different community leaders to do these projects and do the work that we do. And now it's trying to figure out how to build that up for a future generation as well. We're also doing lots of other things. We've really focused on developing educational programs because these water problems are really complex, and there's not a lot of good materials out there. This is all relatively new stuff. All this stuff with arsenic and fluoride and all this stuff, it's really over just the last 20 years, which in the grand schemes is a pretty small amount of time, that we're really understanding the impacts, and especially like community-based materials, like they just don't exist And we've also done lots of things with like both rural and urban high schools. And then again, mentioning our urban water initiative, which we just launched last year, which is also focusing on the urban center of San Miguel, given that these issues are coming to the forefront here. We implement a lot of different solutions as well, the main ones being rainwater harvesting systems. This is a big tank here. This is for one family. And the idea is that we work together with grassroots organizations as well as the rural communities to implement these different solutions. We have a bunch of different models we do. We build these big tanks because we have to store enough water for drinking and cooking for a family to last the entire dry season. But these systems will provide a family a lifetime of access to clean drinking water. This is enough water to last that entire dry season. It'll fill up again during the rainy season, and it'll last all throughout the year. And with a simple filter that I'll talk about later, just 15 minutes outside of San Miguel. And we've worked in about 90 different communities, mostly rural communities, 30 schools. Between 2020 and 2021, we're actually able to triple our impact of rainwater harvesting systems through new collaborations that we're building with national foundations, with groups like Rotoplas and others, creating millions of liters of storage and 35,000 people impacted throughout Mexico right now. So I just want to briefly talk about our technology development. We have about 3 full-time engineers on staff, and then we have a network of what we call technical fellows. These are young engineers who are just out of usually their master's program or undergrad, who can come with us for 6 to 12 months. We've got 3 right now, and help support our technology development side of the organization. And we have, through that, built these relationships with all these different universities, and we have all these researchers come down to help us build out these technologies. So we've been able to do a lot with just a pretty small technology team in-house, working with various different universities, things like Engineers Without Borders, and all sorts of other groups to develop these solutions. We have 3 major projects right now. I don't want to talk about all of them in great detail, but one is talking about how do you test for arsenic in the field. It's actually really hard to test for, and so we're working with Imperial College of London on a cool thing there. But these other 2 are pretty important for us, so I'm just going to talk about them very briefly. Agua is this guy right here. This is a filter that gets rid of those little monsters, those little pathogens. But when you pair this with rainwater, then you've got a really great solution here. And we've spent several years developing this new model, which can be fit into any sort of container. And so this is a program in Chiapas that we were able to ship our filters out there, which is a really low-cost filter that can adapt to any sort of container. It's called Agua. We won an innovation award for it by the American Society of Mechanical Engineers in 2019. And it's a pretty simple idea, but this little guy, can just kind of plug into any sort of container, which makes it great for like disaster and emergency response. We're talking with some groups down in Oaxaca who were just hit by the hurricane about how to just send those filters out to them, and then they can create their own filtration system. I won't go too much into depth on that because I just want to briefly talk about our groundwater treatment system. So this is something that we've been developing for about 6 years now, and this is an arsenic and fluoride community scale treatment plant. So it's removing arsenic and fluoride from the community level. So why are we doing that if we have rainwater, right? Well, we have to build these big rainwater tanks, and that's great. Like, it's the most actionable thing that we can do is collect rainwater and filter it, but it's expensive. The long-term cost is definitely low, but it's all in the upfront investment of building that giant water storage tank. You're upwards of, on the biggest ones that we do, about $1,000 per system per family, right? And so if you look at the need, that adds up very, very quickly. And so what we've been developing is this community scale treatment plant that this system itself costs about the same, at the initial install as one rainwater harvesting system for one family, but this is treating water for dozens of families. And this can be scaled to treat for hundreds of families. In fact, it only makes sense at scale, and so we're working on that right now. We have our first one in operation. It took us years of development because specifically how to deal with fluoride is a very difficult thing, but we figured it out. It's the first of its kind in the world that's really doing this, and it's providing clean drinking water for a local community, and now we're looking about how we can now scale this, not just here, but create a model here in Guanajuato, and then scale that out to other places who are impacted throughout Mexico that are dealing with this. So it's a pretty exciting thing that we're doing with this guy right now. And then just very briefly, I want to talk about this idea of advocacy. And this is the idea how do we change, how do we really deal with the root causes of all this? Because on the one side, building rainwater systems and arsenic fluoride treatment plants, this is all great stuff, right? But it's not talking about why is the water overexploited in the first place? Why are we losing water? Why is the arsenic and fluoride in there? Why is it becoming more concentrated? And so we've been doing this for over 10 years, as I mentioned, and we're finally at the point now where we feel like, okay, we're not going to let go of that, because doing that community scale work is incredibly important, specifically because these people don't have the luxury of waiting the potentially years or decades it's going to take to create true systemic change in this. But now we're at a point that we can start investing in that. So we're working with national networks, with other governments and things like that, to actually look at strategies on how we can pressure things like the agriculture industry to change their ways and do things like that. And because this is a national problem, this is not just here in Mexico. So what we have here, this is from UN data that looks at the share of population with access to safely managed drinking water around the world. So here you've got the global average right here. So globally, we've been doing some good work over the last 20 years. This is the last 20 years. We're closing that gap. Latin America on a whole is doing pretty well. Mexico, on the other hand, is doing abysmally. It's been pretty much static for the 20 years that we've been collecting this data. 57% of the country still doesn't have access to safely managed drinking water here in Mexico. 57%. Mexico is one of the most developed countries here, and it's the lowest in Latin America for the countries that they're collecting this data, at least. It's the lowest that has access to clean drinking water, which is, it's just shameful, to be honest. And now we're starting to see things like really underdeveloped countries like the Congo that are surpassing Mexico. It's a country that has 1/20th of the GDP of Mexico, and some major other issues that are going on. They've surpassed Mexico in access to clean drinking water since like 2012, I think. And when you look at the least developed countries on a whole, globally, there's a lot of work going on there. And they're catching up to Mexico, some of the most least developed countries in the world. So this is a really true systemic issue we have here in the country. So that's why we're talking about this advocacy and the stuff that we're trying to do as, a pretty small organization in the grand scheme of things, but we have some pretty good things that we can do with that. So, just want to say we don't do this alone by any means. We work with a lot of different groups to get this work done, and that's how we're able to create, I think, a pretty big impact for the size of our organization, to be honest. All sorts of different institutions, but one thing I just want to know here, what we have done here are really our grassroots community partners, and these are the people who, are never in the limelight, but these are grassroots organizations, community organizations that we work with very, very closely to develop these projects, develop solutions together, install them. They're really the backbone of all the work we do, and obviously we need lots of funding and things like that to make it happen. So just to say where we're going, we're really scaling our impact as far as our community work is going. We've brought in some new institutional partners, specifically the Rio Rante Foundation out of Mexico City, which is one of the largest supporters of water projects in Latin America, the Ashoka Network, and groups like Rotoplas who've come on board, which are allowing us to really up our impact, and we're looking to impact over 40 new rural communities over the next couple of years with rainwater and other solutions. With our technology development, we're really taking over the next 2 years or so, well, 5 years, but we're taking that groundwater treatment system and really scaling that up to create major impact in this region and then be ready to be scaled into other parts of Mexico. And we're taking our filter to market actually to help create a sustainable income stream for the organization over the long term. And then again, I talked about this, but I just want to say that we're really focusing on where can we create the points of pressure to really look at the long-term system change that's really needed to deal with the root causes of all of our water problems. So, promise, this is the end. About 5 minutes longer than I wanted. That's not too bad. 5 minutes isn't that bad. I was hoping to get it under 45, but so I just want to reiterate, because I know I threw a lot of information at you guys today. But what are the most important takeaways? Well, our water supply is finite. It's not a renewable resource, as I've said numerous times, and it's dwindling. It's increasingly contaminated with, again, arsenic and fluoride, which again are very, very hard to remove and deal with. As much as we might be upset about development and things like that, it really is the growing industrial agriculture industry that is the main culprit for all of this. It really is. I don't know how else to say it. Agricultural production keeps on going up every single year here in the region, and we keep losing more and more water because of it. So this creates risks for all of us, but it really is low-income rural communities. There are things that all of you can do here to make sure that your water is safe for drinking and all of that. We're lacking, awareness and some technicians and things like that, which is why I'm here today, is trying to build that awareness and doing all sorts of other things. But it really is these low-income rural communities that have access to one well, that don't have the luxuries that we have, that are at the greatest risk here. And so because of that, we really have to create, what I call a balance. And I talked about this, but we got to create these solutions and implement them to provide clean water access, but we can't forget about, this larger root causes of these issues, and that's what, we're just starting to get into, to create really long-term coherent water policy and management. And so again, a lot of people ask, well, why are you doing that if that's not going to solve the problem? It's like, well, because that's real people that have no other option, and we have to find ways to help them today because they don't have the luxury of waiting, again, the years or decades it's going to take to create that true systemic change that's really necessary, but it's not to say that we shouldn't focus on that. We need to focus on both of them at the same time. I don't know if this is a good thing, but water scarcity and contamination and chemical contaminants, they're impacting water supplies around the globe. So we're not alone. That's both a good thing and a very depressing thing, I know, but it also means that there's a lot of other great organizations, great work being done globally to look at all these kind of issues. And as these issues are becoming more and more in the forefront, hopefully we're going to have a lot more solutions coming out. And I just want to end saying that this can be solved. It really can. It just requires a lot more effort, a lot, increasing awareness, and obviously support. So that's where I will end it for now. Yeah. Thank you. So is there any questions? Is that what we're doing? Questions? Right. Yeah. Well, that's, I guess, the advantage of having our groundwater be so overexploited is that eventually they will be, but it might be centuries. Because at the rate that water moves through infiltration, we're talking about centimeters per year. I mean, it's going to take potentially hundreds of years for that water. So we've only really been putting pesticides into the agricultural, production for the past several decades. And so it's probably going to take upwards of a century or more for that to become a problem. So we've been looking at it. There's been some more surface area water that, looks like groundwater, smells like groundwater, but probably is not groundwater because it has some issue with some nitrates and things like that. But it's very specific areas that have, potentially massive or very quick infiltration. So generally speaking, it's not an issue now. It will be an issue in the future. That's a great question. Yeah.
Hi. How about all the silver mining that went on in the area for so long? Did that contribute to the pollution of the aquifer?
It's a good question. I've never had that question. I don't have a good answer for that right now, actually. Because silver mining, there's a lot related to it, especially with things like arsenic and cyanide and things like that as well. And mercury, and we have some spikes in mercury in some certain areas as well. So I don't know if that historic mining has had a big impact. There's new mining companies that are trying to come in right now, which will absolutely have an impact on water supplies for sure. So it's a good question. I don't know how much it would be related. It could be specifically related to some of the arsenic issues where there's really high arsenic. I haven't actually seen if there was mining there before, but we have certain areas that have really, really high levels of arsenic that it's possible that there could be another way of that getting in through things like mining. Any other questions? Oh, hey, Margot.
Can you go over the costs once again of the water options for here in San Miguel of putting how much does it cost to put a water osmosis system in? And the cistern program sounds wonderful because then you're actually not using the public water at all, which is a nice thing. But I heard a high number there, which might be out. I heard you say it was $10,000. I think maybe I misheard.
Oh, I was saying it's hard to get to that number.
Okay,
No,
that's what I thought you said. But Personally, for me, one of the first things I want to do is to address this in my own life, in my own home, and then after I do that, I'm going to be trying to influence friends and neighbors to do the same in their own home. Certainly the idea of using our existing cistern seems like the most responsible for me, because then you're not using any water. You're really doing that. So if you could just walk us through the two systems and
Sure.
the relative cost, because 10 grand is a lot for an individual to be thinking about.
No. I was saying that, yeah, it's hard to get to 10 grand. Like, it should be relatively cheap, depending on how you want to do it. So the reverse osmosis is easy. That's a few thousand pesos for the system. You know, you can buy them for $150 on Amazon. It's really proven technology. It's been around for forever, and it works really, really well, and it's really easy to test again. The maintenance, you know, you're going to spend $100, depending on your use, a couple thousand pesos a year maybe on it. And then you have to pay for it to be installed, which, you know, plumbers we've seen can do it as inexpensively as 1,000 to 1,500 pesos maybe. Depends, but it's pretty low, and so it pays for itself very quickly. If you're buying bottled water, it pays for itself, you know, pretty quickly. Reverse osmosis. Rainwater is going to be a little bit more complicated. It depends on what you want to use it for. So if you want to use it for drinking water, then there's some other considerations. You want to make sure that your roof doesn't have a toxic sealant on it and things like that. And so if it does, then you might have to build some other roof structure. And so there's a lot of considerations that go into the rainwater system. It's really going to be on a per person basis. You know, you can build a rainwater system if you have the space, build a cistern, and you know, if you don't have to build a new roof and things like that. You know, we do it for about $1,000, in some cases less. So you can do it for relatively cheap. That'll be, you know, cheaper and easier over the long term than even reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is going to be cheaper on the upfront. Rainwater is always going to be a little bit more expensive on the upfront, but the long term is going to be lower. So it depends. If you're going to build a new cistern, if you have to build a new roof structure and things like that, it could be relatively expensive. But again, they can be as cheap as a few $100 to $1,000, and as expensive as the sky's the limit on what you want to do with it. I mean, you can do a really elaborate system. You can capture hundreds of thousands of liters if you want. In that case, you have to build a really big cistern to store a lot of water, and that can be expensive, but that could completely, you know, get you off of city water and things like that. So, rainwater is going to be very, very context specific on how big you want to go with it. Any other questions? No? Okay, so I'm just going to introduce Dixie Ashley, who's been a long-term volunteer with us, to say a few words, because people also ask about what they can do. I guess I just want to say one thing. We're bringing Dixie up here, but you know, there's a bunch of things you can do. You can sign up for our mailing list. Please do if you're not already on it. It's right over here. And we send out like lots of materials. We have things like a monthly bulletin that's constantly updating on the current, you know, what's going on with water here in San Miguel. You know, we have one on, I didn't talk about it today, but there's a whole plan for water for the future of urban San Miguel. It's called the Agua. We have a whole thing on it. I encourage you to read it. And you can get your water tested, as I mentioned. There's also other things you can do, like educating others and doing something that we call like a meet and greet, which is, you know, hosting us in your home to bring in some of your neighbors to do a shorter version of the talk to learn about this kind of stuff. And yeah, Dixie.
So is everybody smarter now? Everybody learned something? And just to reiterate what Dylan said, we count on that. We're sort of a grassroots organization, so we ask that each of you go tell your neighbors and your family and your friends, tell them about this organization and get them to be as passionate as we are, because it truly affects all of us. And you know, we're funded by donations from people like yourselves. We also get grants, but that's how we are completely funded. And just an example of how that works is, out in the communities you saw the cisterns that people have sweat labor and they build those themselves. One of those costs $600 US dollars. So that literally will change a family's life. So if you can imagine, I counted, and there are about 10 people in here right now. If every one of you contributed $60, that changes a family's life. There's different ways to give. You can give online, you can give here. And also imagine what you spend on a lunch. You know, I think you can still buy a cheap lunch in San Miguel for about $10 US, right? Maybe about 200 pesos. So for that 200 pesos, if you were to donate that once a month, that's 120 US dollars. And if 5 of you did that, boom, we have a rainwater catchment system. So please consider donating to us, and also consider if you'd like to host an event at your home where we can invite your neighbors and your friends and we can educate them as well. Please consider doing that. Just see me about that afterwards, okay? Thank you all for coming. We greatly appreciate it, and go be our ambassador, okay? Thank you.
Well, thank you once again. It was a lot of information. Thank you, Dylan. I'm trying to absorb as much as I can. And well, this is your house. If you need more space with us, of course, whenever you want, we can schedule that one. And well, you heard her. Pass the word. Let's make this bigger, no? And well, to continue for the next salon that it's going to be held on the 17th of June, we're going to have Arturo Morales. Arturo Morales has been working in many places here in San Miguel with the government, so he knows a little about what's happening also with the water, with the environmental issues, so he can help us understand and tell us what to do, no? As Caminos de Agua is doing right now. The title for the next event, it's Let's Make Peace with Nature. So this one is Water and Environmental Challenge within the framework of contemporary environmental challenges on the planet. San Miguel de Allende and the Frontera de Tierra Adentro will review the characteristics, diagnosis, and opportunities that we observe in a sense of urgency around demographic dynamics, humanity's abuse of natural resources, mainly water, and the impacts of humanity around waste, transformation of ecosystems, and threat to the Earth's biodiversity, the only we have. So hopefully we can see you, if not before, on the 17th. Thank you once again, and take care. See you soon. Bye-bye.